My name's David Feith, and I'm representing my father, who was Herb Feith, or he was officially called Professor Herb Feith. He was a professor of politics at Monash University from 1968. So in 1971 he was Professor of Politics at Monash University in Melbourne. He died in 2001, so I haven't been able to ask him, but from what I know, he was, in his professional life, he was particularly interested in Indonesia primarily, but more broadly in Asia. He was, after he finished university, he went as a young man to live and work in Indonesia as a volunteer graduate, and he then sort of set up a volunteer graduate scheme where Australians would go and work in Indonesia. And then he did a PhD on Indonesian politics and started teaching at university, mainly about Indonesian politics, but then it broadened out to be Asian politics, and he was, like in his work, in Indonesia in 1965 there was a coup and a lot of massacres occurred, and he was quite critical of the government that came to power. And so for some time he wasn't able to go to Indonesia. He wasn't able to travel to Indonesia. So I think he was kind of looking for other things, areas of work that he might be interested in. But also, personally, he himself had been a refugee from Europe. He and his parents were Jewish refugees who left Europe at the time of the Nazis. So he had experienced being a refugee himself. So he always had a very strong sympathy for refugees. And when stories started appearing in the press in Australia about the refugees who were fleeing from East Bengal to West Bengal, he was, I think that touched him, as a sort of human response to people suffering, as well as his more professional sort of work interest in politics in Asian nations. So I think there was a range of different things that, after he died, a biography has been written about my father called From Vienna to Yogyakarta, The Life of Herb Feith, and I actually organised to have a copy sent to the Bangladesh High Commission, so I guess they've forwarded it to the Ministry of Foreign Affairs here. But when I read the biography that was written about him, what was often said about him was that he was someone who was both an academic and an activist. He wasn't simply an academic. He became involved in issues that he thought were important, and this was one of them. Before I came here, I contacted one of the other people who'd been involved and talked to him a bit about that. I remember a little bit, like they used to have meetings sometimes at my house, but sometimes at other houses. Basically, it was to try and raise awareness in the Australian community of the issue of Bangladesh and to put pressure on the Australian government to recognise Bangladesh. This was in 1971, and so they met, they raised money to send assistance to the refugees, and also, so it was sort of both humanitarian and political. They were trying to raise money to provide relief assistance to the refugees and put pressure on the Australian government to recognise Bangladesh, and also, I suppose, raise awareness in the Australian community generally about the need to recognise Bangladesh as an independent nation. He gave one lecture which has been published that was at an Asian Studies conference. It's called Asia's Flashpoint 1971 Bangladesh, and it says in the introduction, this was the second in the series of Flinders Lectures in Asian Studies. And this lecture was delivered at Flinders University on September 14th, 1971, and it was reproduced for wider circulation after the lecture. So, my father wasn't a scholar of Bangladesh or of South Asia, but it's a very thorough sort of, he traces the history of partition and a number of things that occurred after partition that explain why the crisis occurred. So, it's quite I just read it again on the plane on the way over here, and I thought it's really quite a good article. Well, from my perspective, in explaining to I suppose an Australian audience who probably didn't know a lot about this region. I knew them already because I'd talked to my father about it, but I suppose what struck me again is what a strange creation Pakistan was, you know. And what I found really interesting, he says that when it talks about, he traces a little bit about the Indian nationalist movement and how in the 30s the Muslim League in India started talking about having separate, apparently the idea in the 30s was that there would be separate states for Muslims. It wasn't one separate state, it was that there would be, you know, a Hindu India, and that there would be separate states for Muslims, and that there was consideration that there might be a separate state for Muslim in the northwest, where Pakistan is, and that there might be one in the east, where Bangladesh is. But then later, Jinnah wanted to have one nation, and so the idea of Pakistan sort of developed as one nation, whereas earlier on it had been possibly several, you know, and I think around the time of independence, Hyderabad also was an independent state in the centre of India that had a Muslim majority and Muslim ruler, and there was also, they were interested in also being a separate Muslim state, but they didn't. They were surrounded by India, so it wasn't kind of so feasible. But I thought that was interesting, that maybe there was earlier on this idea that maybe two separate Muslim states, but the idea of actually having one country, Pakistan, with these two bits, you know, West Pakistan and East Pakistan with India, it doesn't make sense. You know, it's such a strange idea to have. And he talks about, well, what was it that unified Pakistan? And there wasn't, he says that there wasn't actually very much. There was Islam, but, you know, Islam wasn't enough to unify people because there were so many other differences, like language and culture. And he wrote a number of other articles. So this was an advertisement that the Committee to Support Bangladesh paid to have this advertisement put in a national newspaper in Australia. It says, an urgent appeal to everyone concerned about what's happening in Bangladesh, in East Bengal. We are convinced that the brutal actions of the Pakistan Army in East Bengal since March have made it impossible for Pakistan to survive on the basis of its 1947 borders, except by the sustained oppression of 70 million Bengalis. 2, that peace will not return to East Bengal until the Pakistan government agrees to negotiate with the leaders of the Bangladesh Provisional Government. 3, that the immediate prospect in East Bengal is of mass starvation on a scale unprecedented in modern history. 4, that only a quick settlement of the Pakistan-Bangladesh conflict will make it possible to avert the deaths of many millions. 5, that the danger of major warfare which could come to involve the superpowers will not pass until there is such a settlement. 6, that concerted action by the world community is an immediate imperative. And then we urge the Australian government, 1, to suspend its aid to the Pakistan government immediately. And I don't know if this was effective or not, but maybe they were. 2, to raise to $5 million its aid to refugees now in India. 3, to add its voice to those seeking the release of Sheikh Mujibur Rahman. 4, to use its influence with its friends and allies to initiate action which will lead the Pakistan authorities to withdraw their troops from East Bengal and negotiate with the Provisional Government of Bangladesh. 5, to move for the immediate initiation of a massive multinational effort to underwrite the rehabilitation of the Bangladesh people and their economy. 6, to support all efforts to guarantee the fully autonomous development of the people of Bangladesh. And then it was signed by a whole lot of people, including quite well-known people from a number of universities, the Australian National University, Monash University, the University of New South Wales, and a number of parliamentarians and authors. So quite high-profile people, including some, you know, very eminent Asianists like Basham, he studied ancient Indian history. He wrote the book The Wonder That Was India, and you know, a number of important academics in Australia. And members of Parliament. So I think this was one of the things my father was quite good at, was getting people involved, and he would have, you know, tried to, you know, as well as speaking at conferences, he would have contacted many people to try to raise their awareness and try and get them to be, sort of concerned enough to add their names to a statement. So this was a statement put out by the Victorian Committee to Support Bangladesh, and it says up the top, convener Professor Herbert Feith, who is my father, and it's a pamphlet that says 9 million refugees and the people of Bangladesh need your support. So this was a pamphlet put out to try and educate Australians about the situation. He says these are the issues, and he quotes Senator Edward Kennedy from the United States. The stark tragedy is not yet understood by the world. I can tell you that not until you see it firsthand can you begin to understand its immensity. And then there's another quote. The Pakistan crisis is the worst disaster that has faced the world for the past 30 years. It is also morally the most simple. The villains, those Pakistani generals who ordered a military attack on their own countrymen last March 25th, are more obviously in the wrong than any military aggressor since the Hitler War. The real charity must be shown in ruthless political action, in sanctions that make it clear to the Pakistani government, which exists only because of international finance and military aid, that it will be worse off if it continues its present policies than if it abandons them. And then after independence, he came and visited in 1972. I think it had a big impact on him. He went from Calcutta to Bangladesh, and that was, 72, that was in the early days of the nation. And I think he said he travelled in a train that there was lots of people travelling on the roof of the train, like it was a really crowded train. And I think he found it very interesting, but also difficult. And I think one of the difficulties was that he didn't speak Bangla, and he was familiar with working in Indonesia where he spoke Indonesian. And I think he found coming to Bangladesh, which, was quite a different place. I mean, maybe there's some similarities with Indonesia in the sense that both have a Muslim majority. So he was very familiar with Muslims, but he, different language, different culture, and I think he felt that in some ways it was difficult for him to engage with people here in the same way that he was able to engage with people in Indonesia. So I think he visited twice in 72, but after that he didn't kind of continue to have a strong involvement with Bangladesh. It was really just for a couple of years that he was strongly involved, and but it was certainly a very important part of his life. I feel very proud and pleased and honoured, and also humbled. It's and also talking to other people today who probably made much more significant contributions. But I feel very proud that my father was making a contribution in Australia, and that even though Australia's a long way away in some senses, there were people in Australia who were concerned, and my father wasn't the only one. But I feel really proud and pleased that that he became involved in this. It wasn't something he had to do, but it was something he felt he wanted to do, and I suppose speaking out on behalf of people who are oppressed, or speaking out on behalf of people who need help, is something that he did throughout his life, and I suppose I've always thought that's a really important thing to do. So I feel really pleased, and it's very exciting to be coming to Bangladesh for this occasion.